Let's talk about the Future Generations Protocol. There's a conference that's going on in Nairobi now, the UN Civil Society Conference, and we had a conversation with the co-chair earlier in the week on what they're looking forward to having. And this is ahead of another meeting that will be taking place in New York later this year in September. We're joined by two ladies in the studio. Tully is a former strategy advisor to Tony Blair and Gordon Brown. These are former UK Prime Ministers. And Sophie Howe is the first Future Generations Commissioner for Wales. Ladies, good morning.
Good morning.
Good Welcome morning to the hot seats of this to the idle listeners. Welcome to the hot seats of the Situation Room. Karibuni sana. Are you here for the conference? Are you here to also talk about the future generations ahead of September?
Yeah, well, we're here both because of the fantastic International Civil Society Summit that's being hosted by Nairobi here. Yep. 4,000 people from all across the world are coming to talk about what do they want from the future. But as well, we're also here because a Senate caucus was set up last night. 9 senators have come together to set up a caucus for the future.
That's interesting. You'll tell us more about it. So to welcome you both into the studio and to this conversation, CT will give you the day's proverb. So CT goes to one African country every week, and then he brings us a proverb a day from that country. Your job is to listen to the proverb. You can write it down. And then you will give us your own interpretation of that proverb. So just listen to it and then tell us what's your interpretation of it. This week, City, you've been in which country?
Well, there's a country in East Africa, well, the East African coast, and the name of the country begins with K. And there's some visitors who are now in the country. Some of them are actually in the studio with us. Take a guess. Which country do you think this is?
Ooh. Tricky.
This is a logic. It's too early on a Friday. Yeah. Come on. Unkind
I
CT.
think they know the country.
And a great country it is too.
Yeah.
Thank you. The proverb, all monkeys cannot hang on the same branch.
All monkeys cannot hang on the same.
Note, I didn't say some monkeys. I said all monkeys cannot hang on the same branch.
Oh, fascinating.
Go, Sophie. Go. What's your interpretation?
Well, okay. So I'm going to talk about how I think this is maybe about sharing the whole tree then. If we've got a lot of monkeys and they can't all be on one branch, we need to be sharing the whole tree, and we need to be actually making sure that the tree is growing and healthy and going to be able to be there for the next generation of monkeys, maybe. I don't know. I think I'm going to bring it back to kind of how we think about the future, I guess, because the future needs to be kind of collaborative. There's lots of things that citizens themselves, I think, could be thinking about the future, setting their own vision for the future. It's not something that governments usually ask citizens to do. We're usually only focused on the here and now, and that's part of the whole problem of why we have climate crisis, why we're not prepared for an aging population in some countries, perhaps whilst we're not taking into account the views of younger people, which are going to be in the majority in this country, for example. So I think there's something there around everyone being part of that tree and recognising there's lots of different perspectives, lots of monkeys on different branches of the tree who've all got a set of vision for their own future.
Nice one. I'm
going to say, on top of that, I think you can't all do the same thing, right? We can't all hang at the same time. Some of us need to plant the trees. Some of us need to tend the trees. Some of us need to look after the trees. And so I think that, especially here in Kenya, where you have great global leaders that have set the example about the importance of planting trees, that's the message I really take from. How about you? What do you think, CT?
The beauty of asking someone to interpret a proverb is this: you cannot possibly be wrong.
Well, that's a good start.
Yes, because it's your interpretation. And we always marvel at how, just at the diversity of interpretation that we get. And we go and say, I hadn't thought of that. I actually hadn't looked at it in quite that way. Well, anyone who's been to a forest where there are monkeys, you will see how monkeys behave. You'll find a few monkeys on this branch, you'll find a few on the other branch, you'll find a few on the other branch. And if there are many on one branch, there'll be a good reason why. Probably that is a branch that actually has whatever it is that they wish to eat in abundance. But not all of them will be there. Others will be elsewhere. Yes.
Good one. Yeah. Peter Otieno has an interpretation. All guests cannot sit on one seat.
Straight and to the point.
So let's begin with just understanding the Future Generations Protocol and this whole concept. I want to start with you, Sophie. First, you are the first Future Generations Commissioner for Wales. What does that mean?
Absolutely. And it's not surprising that you're asking, well, what is this? And I'm sure your listeners are wondering too. And that's because I was the first one in Wales, the first one in the world, actually. So my job in Wales was to make sure that the government of Wales were thinking to the long term. And when they were putting in place policies and taking decisions, that they were thinking about how those things would affect future generations. So that, of course, means our younger generations, but it also means people who are yet to be born, actually. And the reason for that is that so much of the way that we do politics and governance across the world is short term. Everything's got to be done before the next electoral cycle, before the next election. And so these big long-term issues that we're facing, climate change, demographic change, AI, automation, what will the effect of that be? What do we need to be doing in our education system now to make sure that our children, young people have the right skills for the future? Often governments are not geared up to take those long-term decisions because they only work in those short-term cycles. So what we're talking about here in Nairobi this week, and indeed across the world in the run-up to this UN Summit of the Future, is how can we get more governments thinking about the interests of future generations.
So what's your daily job then as
So the day job...
Future Generations Commissioner.
Yeah, the day job is things like scrutinising government policy. We had passed a law in 2015 in Wales called the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act, and that sets out some long-term goals which were co-created between the government and citizens. So I'm testing whether the government are taking actions to meet those long-term goals. I'm also testing and scrutinising their policies to say, how have you considered the future? What long-term trends and scenarios have you looked at? Are you meeting the long-term objectives that you've set around climate change, for example? So I suppose it's that kind of voice of the future, quite a difficult kind of concept because, you know, I can't predict the future, but there are certain things that we can say future generations are going to need clean air to breathe. They're going to want good health. They probably want to live in connected communities and so on. So my job was to really test and scrutinise and challenge government around how their policies were doing that.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah.
How exactly do you enact laws in Wales? Do you have public participation? Are the citizens involved in the process of lawmaking?
Yeah, well, in this case, for the Future Generations Act, we held a national conversation with citizens in Wales, where we posed the question, what's the Wales you want to leave behind to your children, your grandchildren, and future generations to come? And as I said, governments don't usually have those sorts of conversations with citizens, where we ask citizens, what's important for you to leave behind? And when you do have those conversations, you get a much deeper sense of values around fairness, around lots of things around our language, our culture and heritage being passed on to the next generation, lots of things about protecting our natural resources. And they formed, the citizens, what the citizens said, formed those long-term goals in the law.
I agree with you, and I think it's a good thing you did, but my question was around just the laws that govern the welfare of the people, say, of your country. I assume you have members of parliament.
Yep.
You have wards or the equivalent of the boroughs and the like. And I assume that whenever they want to move forward, they engage people and they talk to them and people give their views. So arguably, one could say that even when laws are enacted, people have had a say.
Absolutely, yeah.
But then I hear you to be saying that over time, some of these things change and the laws remain what they are. So now they have to be questioned and said, okay, you know, this law makes sense and it made a lot of sense. But looking into the future, let me ask the question again. I'm going to rephrase it. So are we saying that when laws are made, or the laws that we are speaking of in your part of the world, that the laws focused on the here and now and in the not too long future, as opposed to giving it the broad spectrum that you're speaking of?
Yeah, and I think that certainly has been the case, but in Wales now we have this overarching law, if you like, the Future Generations Act, which says all laws that have come after that must show how they've considered the future. And that's the difference, I guess. Whereas for most parts of the world, there's not that consideration. Nobody's saying, how is this law going to play out in 10, 15, 20 years' time?
Okay. Kat, I want to come to you. Just as Sophie, you've also advised governments on what they're doing. Strategy advisor for Tony Blair, for Gordon Brown. Did you face the same challenge of an administration that's just looking politically and looking at political survival for now? You know, you're leading a political party and you're thinking of the next election, and so decisions are not actually long-term. And I'm asking that on the back of what we know. What we know is that there are very many countries that develop long-term plans, a 30, 40-year, 50-year plan. Are you saying that those two are disconnected? The long-term plan plus the political survival of the day?
These are great questions. I think that the interesting thing that is happening is that we have realised that there's a really important stakeholder in decisions made today, and those stakeholders are future generations. And we didn't put that much attention on them 10 years ago or 15 years ago, but now we're realising with things like emerging technology, with demographic trends, with the climate change impact that we're having, that the fact that they don't actually have an official voice in our representative democratic systems, whether it's the executive or the parliament, that actually is now creating problematic decisions, that we're kind of exporting harms into the future, and someone in the system has to represent them and give them a voice, which is effectively was Sophie's role. And what we're seeing is across the world that is an issue that people are realising is really important. So Parliament, which is obviously the space for bipartisan holding of the long term beyond the executive, you know, you vote your government in for the next 2 to 5 years' time across the world, but then actually it's Parliament that then thinks about what is stewarding the long-term interests of the country from a debt perspective. And so a lot of governments are really beginning to think through, how do you actually create committees of the future whose role is to do, well, first of all, to engage the public, to say, well, what would you like to see from the future out for your children or your children's children? It's not a political issue. It's like we're all interested in this collective future, but also then to scrutinise decisions, to ask that question, if it's pensions, if it's a state budget, if it's actually regulating AI, it's about thinking about, well, what's the impact in the longer term as well as now? Which are the generations which are paying for this, and which are the ones that are benefiting from it? And that's actually a really powerful question to ask, not just... And, you know, we think the future is important because it's out there, but actually, you know, if we don't talk about the future now, we just assume the future is like today. There's a term called like the used future or the official future, or in fact the future gets colonized because other people bring their ideas of what your future should look like to you. So what's really important is this capacity that we call strategic foresight, and in particular that parliamentarians work with their citizens in their communities, as you're saying, in their wards, in their counties, to kind of go, well, what is it that we imagine our community to look like for the future that we can all work towards? And that, I think, in a world of where, you know, mistrust in governance, where we're finding ourselves facing quite a few challenges around the environment, around housing, around jobs, that's, I think, the kind of really optimistic conversation that we can have.
Do these conversations on a global scale take into consideration what is currently happening in countries? Because is it possible to talk about a future without taking into consideration what is happening now?
And also the past.
Right.
Yes,
and what
absolutely, yes.
What I do now is going to have an impact on what happens at 7:30. What I say now is going to have a future is a minute from now, future is a day from now, future is months from now.
Yeah.
So are these conversations then taking into consideration what is happening in governments, in countries at the moment? Can Parliament talk about or legislate for what will happen in the future without considering what is currently happening?
I think you're absolutely right. And sometimes when we talk about future generations, or, we talk about the conflict between Gen Alpha, which is our younger generation now, and the boomers, who are our older generations. And I actually think that that's the wrong way of looking at it, because actually when you think about, what do we prioritise, there are things that you can do which are good for both current and future generations. If we start thinking, for example, about our education system, or how we might reskill people within our countries to take advantage of the new jobs that are coming through the green transition, for example. Huge possibilities there in terms of job creation. If we create good quality jobs for people, that actually means people are taken out of poverty in the here and now. It also means we're better equipped to meet the kind of challenges of the environmental targets that we've set in the future. So that's good for current generations and future generations. If we invest, for example, in improving the quality of people's homes, that's good for current generations. It's good for future generations because it means that they'll have less carbon emissions. It's good for current generations. Jobs are created, and that has a long-term impact. So I think what we're trying to do is to get governments to apply that test. What are the things that we can prioritise that are not just going to be short-term for this generation, but are actually going to be good for both current generations and future generations? Sometimes that's about the choices that we make, and sometimes that's about the way in which we carry out policy, and putting that kind of current and future lens on it ultimately gets us better decisions.
Can you have a future conversation without having reached a certain level of actualization? Because if we're asking for conversations to be had across the globe in terms of what's happening in the future, we still have very many bread and butter conversations that are happening today. That have you created a conducive enough environment as government for all your people to have the basics? I'm talking about basics. Have you eaten today? Do you have some level of sustenance, and can this be sustained? Do you have access? I mean, if you want to look at what the globe tells us about SDGs, do you have the 1, 2, 3s in order? And so it seems aspirational that we can talk about the future when we have not gotten today sorted out. Not that it's not an important, but where does it fit? Where does a current situation which is trying to be handled fit in a future discussion?
That's a great question, which is basically, is it a luxury to think about the future when we've got so many challenges now in the present? Now, I would say thinking about the future is absolutely a must-have, because it isn't about doing things differently in the future it's actually about doing things differently in the present. So it means that you prioritise your budget to invest in things like education for children, ensuring that issues around food security, that making sure that AI is rolled out in a way that it doesn't compromise jobs or sustainable livelihoods in the here and the now. So it's absolutely important to do now. And to your point about the past, I think it's really interesting. Paul Sappho always says that you need to look back twice as far as looking forwards. And I think there is something powerful about understanding that, where we are today is what our grandparents left us. They put things in place, and that legacy of looking back into the past and weaving your future from what your ancestors gave you, I think is a very important point to notice, that we too have an obligation as well to be good ancestors. And that this, I think, that sense of hope and that sense of agency is a key aspect of what makes us human, part of our communities, and it's and that is not, again, a luxury. That is absolutely a must-have.
And I think, just in some of those practical examples of a country that's attempting to do this, and none of it is easy, but if we think about the kind of basics that you were talking about there, believe it or not, in the UK, one of the richest countries in the world, we've had increasing levels of child poverty. There are kids going to school hungry and so on. And so some of those policy interventions that we have put in place, free school meals, for example, now that's investment in the here and now. It's also a really long-term investment for improving the health and well-being, educational attainment and all of these things of our kids. But the added thing around that when we start thinking about the future is how do we make sure that the food that we're providing in schools is connected back to sustainable farming? How do we make sure that the food that we're procuring in our schools through our contracts is not being procured to go into the profits of the mega corporates, but is actually going back into the pockets of local farmers and local communities who are also going to be, supplying that food and growing that food in a more sustainable way. So when you start thinking about all those connections, that is where you get some really good policy interventions, which are good for both current generations and future generations across a much wider spectrum than perhaps the original policy started with.
It's an interesting discussion. The cyclical nature of it is what I find interesting in this sense. We talk about policies, we talk about technological advancements, and the thread that intertwines and weaves all these properties into one is the human person.
Yep.
And the environment in which this person grows, develops, is socialized, more or less determines the interaction with everything that we're saying. And that's why the education systems in the world are very key to this very discussion about the future. But also key in these education systems is understanding something fundamental, and that human beings are social creatures. See, when you talk about children going hungry in a rich country, what does it tell you about the people of that country? What does it tell you about the relationships that people have in that country, how they relate to each other?
I think that tells you that we've not prioritised some of the things that actually matter. So there's that famous quote that GDP, economic growth, if you like, measures everything in life except that which makes life worthwhile. And I think that, we're all focused, and governments are often measured by how strong is the economy and so on. But actually, in really overly focusing on that, we've lost sight of the things like human connection, like, like equity, like making sure that in the richest country in the world, one of the richest countries in the world, our kids aren't going hungry. So this is why we need this kind of fundamental reset, which is both around thinking to the long term as well as the short term for current generations. But actually in Wales, what we've done is gone further than that by saying we are going to focus everything we do around a set of well-being goals, not around GDP, not around economic growth, but a set of goals for well-being. One of those is actually about connected and cohesive communities. One's about equality. One's about creating the conditions where people's health can thrive.
It's an interesting discussion. I look at traditional societies that are referred to as being traditional. People who haven't lost that connectivity. And yet, you will find in many of these communities, they are thriving and striving, striving to keep up with the world that emphasizes technology, self, not community, and the advancement of self and the accumulation of wealth. But none of these things are really bad. Wealth is good to accumulate, but the point is at the expense of the very things that matter, and that is the fundamental human relationships. The countries that, you both come from the same country, really, Great Britain.
I don't know, there's a thing between the English and the Welsh.
There's a thing between the English and the Irish. There's a thing between the English and the Scots. It's one country, Great Britain. Okay, why do I mention this? I mention this because if you look at the price one pays for advancement, what do we call advancement? The fundamental question is it actually worth it?
And that is the absolute key question. What is advancement? And I think, there's been this very westernized view of advancement, that it's technology, it's owning more and more things, it's consuming more and more things. And actually that has resulted in the planetary crisis that we're in. It's resulted in a breakdown of community cohesion. It's resulted in, global barometers telling us there's a massive decline in trust in institutions. That has a threat to democracy. So what I would say is actually we've got it fundamentally wrong, and we need to go back to some of the basic things, as you're describing, around human connection, around what matters. And we need some brave leadership to take us from our obsession with growth at any cost, back to some of those fundamentals.
That's a very tough one. Tully is a former strategy advisor to Tony Blair and Gordon Brown, former UK Prime Ministers. Sophie Howe is a Future Generations Commissioner for Wales. First in the world, first in Wales. Okay, first in Wales, first in the world. One way or the other. They are here to talk about the Future Generations Protocol and what's in it for Kenya, what's in it for Africa. There's an ongoing conference in Nairobi, the UN Civil Society Conference. It's a build-up to something that will be happening again in September. What's it called in the September one?
Summit of the Future.
It's the Summit of the Future. That will be taking place in September, not in Nairobi, but this time in New York. Development, as we've gotten to define it, and the way we've gotten to define, development and advancement, is it really worth it?
Absolutely. When we're making decisions, are we effectively putting our future at risk? Are we doing the right things for the people in the community around us? And are the structures of government and economics around us actually supporting that decision-making process in service of our well-being, or are they undermining planetary boundaries? And I think that's the crux that the Summit of the Future is really trying to address. The Secretary General of the UN basically said in his report to the world's governments 3 years ago that the world faced a transition, a crossroads. But like here in Kenya, you did some scenarios in 1991 called Kenya at Crossroads, and I think the world is now at a crossroads. We can either go down one path, which is transition, climate, move away from a carbon-intensive economy and move towards equality, or we can continue down the pathway which is going to drive intense inequality, conflict, migration internally, displacement across the world, and real problems economically in the long term. So that is the very stark choice facing us that the Secretary General said. And he said, we need a summit of the future that helps us come together to think about what are the kind of governing institutions that we need at the international level, but also at our governments, that can help us make that right choice. And there's a collective action issue, right? Because it's, as often I find, people want to do the right things at our communities and our governments, and we see the signals around us. We see those dystopian futures. We watch them on TV. We know what good futures look like, but we seem to be stuck. And that is a governance question, right? How do we come together and create change? And the answers are potentially institutions, participatory dialogues, and also individual people like Sophie, commissioners that can help us steer the way.
So we are at a crossroads.
We are at a crossroads.
Are we at the same crossroads, though? The global north and the global south, are we at the same crossroads? There are those that have argued that these conversations from people in the global north who are facing basically the realization of the past mistakes that have been made and that have gotten the world to this same point. And there are some in the societies who are saying, all right, we need to course correct. And of course, there are very many others in the same societies who are saying, what's wrong with all we have? Who cares about the future? Okay. And then you come to the global south, the developing world, the one that's just thinking, okay, we want to sort out our basics. And as we sort out our basics, then we'll also deal with our future. We are not at the same crossroads, in my opinion. We're at different crossroads. Yes, we are thinking about the future, but from different perspectives, from different areas and starting points. If we say that we know we are thinking about what the future should look like, and coming back to what CT is saying, so what is it? What's the value? How do we value our lives? Maybe we are at a point where in Africa we value our lives differently, and we are okay the way we are. But there's a pressure to start looking at how the West values life and pushing us towards valuing life like the West values life. And maybe we don't need to do that. Or maybe, and this is the conspiracy theory that I've heard actually being thrown around there, that these conversations are being brought to Africa by the West so that we are told, you guys, you're okay, just stay like that. You know, your future will be sorted. We don't industrialize, because if we talk about industrialization, we talk about climate change and all the things that we're going to do. We don't advance our political systems, because advancing our political systems, look at what we have done to ourselves. But then that development still remains going in the West, and we do not develop at the same pace.
So I couldn't agree more that what is necessary is a very strong African voice in this entire conversation. So the next 8 billion of the world's population, many of them will be in this continent. And if we have a summit of the future in September, it is absolutely imperative that there is a strong African perspective on what you see your futures. And we often, in my field of strategic foresight, use the word future in its plurality to reflect the fact that it's for people to determine, and this is why it's so important to have those voices at the table. So that's why the Senate Committee of the Future and their role in wanting to drive conversations both in Kenya at the county level but also regionally is such an important step forward.
Kat, what in your opinion is a strong voice?
I think it's a voice that has been that has the space to be heard, that has been supported to be able to engage and think about what is happening around and be able to participate deeply and truly in conversations.
Then this continent doesn't have a strong voice. We may be 1.3 billion strong in our population, but in terms of the voice that is heard, listened to, and has impact, we don't have it. So one could even argue that even as we participate physically and we speak in these conferences, it's cosmetic. We don't really count.
Siti, when you say we don't have a strong voice, are we saying that we are not speaking, or are we saying that we are not being heard?
We don't have clout.
So we are not being heard. We are not being given space.
Now we are being accommodated, and we are being given the impression that we are being listened to. And even a conference like the one we have is, look, we even had a conference in your neck of the woods. It means we're taking you seriously. But
the final decision.
We are so far away from the table where these decisions are made. But the funfair is good. We have visitors.
So can I ask the question then based on, I think it's all leading to what I was thinking in my head, is that can we really then say that we are all part of this one, hands around the campfire kind of discussion, if we are not all coming at the same level? Not that you don't speak, but that is what you're saying actually being accepted and really being made part of the decision. And I liken that to what happens with public participation here, whereby we say, okay, yes, we had public participation and there were 300 odd people who showed up representing 3 million. So then when we talk about the African voice, and I'm going to insist on it because I'm part of it, but when we talk about the African voice and we say that, come and let us all talk about your futures together, where we're coming off the back of having been told what to do and how we are going to participate and how you will spend money and how that money will be lent to you and how your people can travel from here to there. Are we really part of the conversation about the future?
So I would love to answer that question, and I'm sure that Sophie will too. I mean, what you're raising is questions of tokenism and performativeness, and I can't tell you how much I absolutely agree that has to be utterly called out, because what we want is meaningful engagement and meaningful conversations and exchange, and that requires, I think, two things. I think that requires accountability and scrutiny mechanisms. So being able to kind of say, well, the decisions that have been made, and genuinely have they reflected those different voices? But then it also requires, as we've been talking about, people who actually have those perspectives being heard. And I just wanted to kind of talk about some of the people that are having these really interesting conversations, whether it's Nsar, who is part of a community working with people in the Congo Basin, imagining what they're kind of eco-activists, having stories about what their futures look like and what they want their community to look like, whether it's Yame, who's doing circular economy work in Botswana, whether it's Pasi Amayo here in Kenya, who's working on some really interesting scenarios looking across issues of energy and environment, not just in Kenya, but also in Mozambique and Angola and beyond. But then how they are then connected to people like Sean, who is a Pacific Islander, who works with tribal leaders looking at how the future of issues around gender and sustainable livelihoods, and that all interconnects in a world where they're being massively affected by climate change. So it's really important that those stories are brought out, that those people and the work that they do, and they are doing amazing work, actually come to the fore and are genuinely heard and acted on.
I actually think that, when we're talking about the future as well, Africa actually needs to have an even bigger voice than everyone else, because you are a continent that is a young majority. So 60% of the entire continent are aged 25 or below, and that is actually the reverse in the global north. So the global north have an ageing population. So when we are talking about the future, younger people, the future is African. So actually, far from having a sort of equal voice in some ways, which is what we're talking about here, and some of the challenges around that, you actually need to have a greater voice, because you are the future. But again, couldn't agree more that I think some of the ways that happens at the moment is entirely unsatisfactory.
How do we break down those walls? Because it seems to have been a conversation that has been at the forefront for a very long time. And if we're talking about that, the world's population who will be young, because these are the actual issues that we speak of, isn't it? When we talk about climate, when we talk about environment, when we talk about business and innovation and technology and education, that we're saying that the folks who are going to grab the world's attention at the age at which then they're the most active are coming from this continent. But for some reason, we're not the ones who are controlling the conversation, but you're saying that we need to be. Are the ones who are currently controlling the conversation ready to let go of the reins and say, let us all truly have an equal conversation? And right now, it doesn't look like that is the case.
Well, that's the million-dollar question, isn't it? And, I know how I would do it if I was in charge, which would be to make sure that you were leading those conversations, because you are the majority. You are these younger countries and the younger continent. But the political system and the multilateral system there are lots of vested interests, and we can see that at the moment through the negotiations, which sometimes don't get a lot of press and publicity. But there are country representatives who are going to the UN saying, no, we don't want a declaration for future generations, and we're not really interested in doing this. Now, play that out in their countries to say, you're telling me that you are a politician or you are representatives of government, and you don't see it as a core role for you to be making decisions which are going to be in the interests of the next generation of your country. I mean, those things absolutely need to be called out, and there are just so many challenges in the system to doing that. But I think the way that you start to do that, and yesterday we were in an event with the Kenyan Senate, or a number of senators who are actually leading the way in this continent, and not just in this continent, but actually the world, in terms of that futures thinking. And I think positioning Kenya as being that kind of leader in this space will also help in terms of amplifying the voice more broadly. That's not the only thing that we need to do, but I think it's part of a solution.
If I can respond to you, Ndu, I think that there's a beautiful saying that we need to midwife the new, and also hospice care the old, and these moments of transition need to be done with empathy and love, but also with justice, right? And we are at a moment of this kind of big transition globally, and there are Sophie mentioned the Future Generations Declaration, and I think there are some really, in this system that we have, that we're trying to make a much more fairer, globally representative system of, where African voices are appropriately represented. There are some acupuncture points that we can push to kind of drive change, and I think the measures that are being discussed in the lead up to the Summit of the Future are exactly those kind of systemic changes that could drive behaviour change at that multilateral system level. And so the Future Generations Declaration would have all member states saying, we need to make sure that when we're making decisions that we are committing to being intergenerationally fair, that we're considering the interests of all generations in the future as well as now. Then you'd have a special envoy at the international level whose role it would be to then scrutinise what happens to make sure that those commitments are met, and also then that member states would be coming together to drive that. So there are these potentials for change, and I really, that's the opportunity in September, is that this drives beginning of a transformation, but it will take time. And I think, as Sophie says, Senator Olakina, Senator Kamar, who was talking about such an important issue, which is, 28% of the population is under grade 8 or younger, how to use that as a superpower and ensure that community of young Kenyans can actually take an effective space at the global conversation is really important. And the work of the Senate and the commitment to doing that, I think, is extremely important in leading the conversations across this continent and globally.
Another controversial point here. All right, so there are those who are saying that the conversation about the future has, very coincidentally come into a very nice point in time when those in Africa who right now sort of have the leverage are starting to talk about, let's relook the past and let's look at justice for what's happened in the past. But now the conversation is sort of being overshadowed by now this new conversation about, no, let's be future thinking. Let's go ahead. Where's the balance between addressing the past and thinking about the future? And then those futures being clearly demarcated. There's a future as it looks like 100 years from today for the global